One of the topics that many Seventh-day Adventists want to know is just where are we with respect to the end of time? There's an economic framework that's been most helpful for me to visualize the relationship between finance and the things to come in the future. A theory called the Kondratiev wave. In 1920, a Russian economist named Nikolai Kondratiev observed that the global economy ran in cycles of about 50 to 70 years. There was a growth phase, which is called spring and summer, and then there was a plateauing of the global economy, autumn, followed by economic winter. Now, economic winters were characterized by stock market crashes, debt crisis, banking crisis, often a global depression, and followed by wars and regime changes. As we look at these Kondratiev waves over the past 200 years and compare that against prophetic events, very interesting patterns appear. Perhaps one of the most prominent things that occurred was in the year 1844, the end of one of these economic winters. William Miller had been preaching about the second coming of Christ to take place in 1844, and this coincided with that economic winter. Miller's success in preaching about the second coming of Christ may have been helped by the economic conditions of the time. People are more receptive to spiritual matters, to turn to God and to seek salvation when the conditions around them are very difficult. So this end of this economic wave came with the fulfilling of the 2,300-day prophecy. Now, the previous wave ended in the year 1789. This was the start of the French Revolution. And as the revolution progressed, it resulted in the arrest and the exile of the Pope in 1798. This was the end of the 1260-day prophecy. And again, there's this close tie between prophecy and the Kondratiev wave. Now, the third cycle ended in the year 1896. This was shortly after the Seventh-day Adventist Church had its 1888 experience. Ellen White wrote that in 1888, the loud cry was starting and that the latter rain was being poured out again. Unfortunately, the church, and in particular its leaders, were not ready for that outpouring of the Spirit, and we didn't see the ultimate fulfilling of the prophecy, which is the second coming of Christ. The next cycle that ended in 1945 was a very catastrophic cycle, which had 2 world wars, an era which made it very difficult for the gospel work to be finished due to the wars and the closed borders. Ellen White had lamented in the year 1903 about what might have been if we had been ready to receive the Holy Spirit. Perhaps it was a cycle that offered no opportunity to finish the work. So we look at the current cycle that we're in today. We're again in economic winter. It started in the year 2000 as the tech bubble burst and the stock market crashed. Since then, governments and central banks have taken extraordinary measures to try and fix the world economy, but their efforts have really only resulted in making things worse. But the message I want to give to people today is not so much that we're in an economic winter, but rather that this economic winter perhaps is harvest time for the church, an opportunity to finish the work that God has given us, a time when people are more receptive to the gospel message and are ready to turn to God and seek salvation. Okay. All right, so I hope that was a good review of what we talked about last night, and for those of you who weren't here last night, I hope that at least gives you a little bit of background into what we're talking about here today. So, still working? There we go. Okay. So, this is the Kondratiev wave, and as I mentioned last night, these are economic cycles that different economists have been studying. It's not my chart. I didn't invent it or anything like that. But you can appreciate that being a Seventh-day Adventist, this has a lot of meaning for us, right? Because of our understanding of prophecy. And as I mentioned yesterday, I do not intend, and I'm not trying to change anything of our traditional view on prophecy, right? If I do that, then I'm offside here, right? I'm trying to reinforce what we believe in and trying to add a little bit more structure and detail as we go through, particularly since 1844, that was the end of the time prophecies, and we're still looking for some other prophecies to happen, but what has come in since 1844 to where we are today, and trying to better understand that. And yesterday we went and talked through some of the history of what we saw in this Kondratiev wave and prophecies and how those were fulfilled. And understanding how prophecy is fulfilled helps us have more confidence in the future prophecies, right? So, and then we looked at it and we sort of talked about past, and we're going to talk during the worship hour, we're going to talk a little bit more about, specifically about this last cycle, right? This, what I call the Laodicean era. But this morning we want to study, this morning we want to study sort of what's going to happen next, right? So we have gone through the cycle, and clearly, you see my arrow here, it looks like we are sort of on this uptrend, if you will, right? Well, why do I say that? Well, remember I told you that this is not looking at, traditionally what economists look at is something we call GDP, gross domestic product, right? That's how you measure the economy. But every country does it differently, so it's really hard to compare, right, and make this global assessment. And so what Kondratiev did, or what Dr. Kondratiev did, was he looked at other things like commodity prices and interest rates, which are universal, right? Price of oil is the price of oil, regardless of where you go, right? It's the same. And so that's what he did. He used commodity prices, wages, things like that to measure economic growth. So when we look at, things like commodities, we see that we are now starting what economists are calling a commodity supercycle, right? And the prices of commodities are going up. Why? Inflation. But why does inflation happen? There's two reasons, right? It's either too much demand or not enough supply, right? Well, demand usually comes and goes. That's a cyclical problem. Last time, remember, we were talking about structural problem or secular problems, things like, well, we didn't drill enough oil wells, so we don't have enough oil, right? Those kinds of things take a long time to fix, right? Those are structural problems, secular problems. And right now we have, a secular problem, a structural problem with commodities, right? We haven't got enough. Not enough food for the world, we don't have enough oil, they want to make electric everything. Do we have enough copper to do that? No, and so on, right? We don't have enough workers. We have a worker shortage right now. So there's structural problems. The other thing I wanted to mention here, and it's important for us to understand this about, when we say structural problems, when we have inflation, right? When we have inflation, one of the first things that goes up in price is what? Is commodities, right? Because it's got a global price, it's global market. As soon as the oil prices go up around the world, it impacts everything immediately, right? And prices of energy, all kinds of things that are market-driven go up. What is the last thing that goes up when inflation happens? Wages, exactly, right? Your paycheck is the last thing to go up when there's inflation, right? Everything else is getting more expensive, and then finally, the workers get upset enough, and then they decide to pay you more, right? But that's what happens. But look, so understand this, right? This is a chart of wage growth, right? And it may look like it's kind of a squiggly lines, but it tells me something. So back in the late 90s, we had some wage growth. It was about 5%. It's grown about 5%, right? And we had inflation. So what does the U.S. Federal Reserve do to fight inflation? No, opposite of that. It increases interest rates, right? It tries to squash demand. It tries to slow down the economy. But in effect, what is it doing? When they tighten interest rates, right, to slow down the economy, you know what they're trying to do? Is stop inflation from growing before your paychecks go up, right? Because what happens is when it gets into wages, into labor costs, that starts to spiral higher, right? There's a cumulative effect on that. So they want to squash inflation before it gets to wages. Does that sound fair? right? Everything else is going up in price, but they're going to squash inflation before it impacts labor costs, right? That's traditionally what they do. And you know, you can look at it very benignly and say, oh, you know, they're trying to fight inflation. But you can look at it more specifically and say, what they're trying to do is make sure that your pay doesn't go up so that exactly, their profits don't go down, right? Because that has a long-term impact on companies. And so the Federal Reserve is not interested in your pay. They're interested in making sure that the profits of the companies that, you know, the banks serve are maintained, right? So in the late 90s, wage growth was going up. What happened? They raise interest rates and slam inflation down. And what happens to wage growth? It goes down, right? And then in 2005, 2006, what happened? Well, wages started to rise again. Oh, no, we can't have that, right? Because we can't have inflation. And so they raise interest rates. And then 2016, 2017, same thing. And then right now, little problem, right? They had a problem because they printed too much money during the pandemic, and that created this huge demand surge. And then a whole bunch of people stopped working, and then so labor costs got out of control. But you know, the government is trying to control natural market that they probably ought not to be doing. So that's the problem here, is that they're sort of meddling in things that they're not really good, or they don't have the tools to do that, right? So they raise interest rates, but does that help you pump more oil? No. Does it help you grow more wheat? No, right? So they're using tools that are not that effective on specific problems that we have today. So I just wanted to sort of give that little bit of background. And you know, this is a very sad thing, right? This is back in 2000, I think it was from 2017. I don't think it's gotten any better, right? 78% of Americans with full-time jobs live paycheck to paycheck, right? But if you look at sort of the background, which I just showed you, you can understand that prices keep going up, our wages don't keep up with it, and so we're always falling further and further behind, right? And the system is sort of set up that way to make sure that profits of companies remain healthy and your stock market is going up, but the individual workers are always under pressure, right? And that's what happens.
It's all about power and control and getting your money.
Yeah, it is. It is,
yeah.
Absolutely. So, so that's the state that we're in today, right? Everybody feels the pressure of rising prices, gasoline, food, you know, tuition for kids who are, you know, if you're in church school, like it's tough, and our wages aren't really keeping up. But if you go back to this quadratic wave, you know, so we should be sort of going on an uptrend. Our wages should be growing. Our, you know, costs are going up, but you know, government is sort of incented to not let that happen, right? And that's where the problem comes in, is that there's this tension between, you know, what the government wants and companies, corporations want, and what we need in terms of the cost of things and wages and so on. But as I look back and say, okay, well, you know, we see this, and every time these cycles end, you know, we saw major prophetic events happen, right? So, but sometimes it takes time for things to develop. So we sort of bottomed in 2020, and I've been talking about this for at least a decade now, and it was interesting when 2020 happened. I was like, what's going to happen? And then, you know, the pandemic hit, and the whole world was sort of upside down, and it was kind of surreal to watch all of this happening in real time. But if we go back into the first cycle there in 1789 to the French Revolution, it sort of gives a better understanding historically of how these things sort of progress, right? So during the French Revolution, well, we started in 1789, but it took almost over a decade for the French Revolution to sort of resolve itself. And we can go through that just a little bit. But what we had during the French Revolution is something what we would call today stagflation, right? What does stagflation mean? Well, stagflation means that meaning stagnant, the economy isn't growing, right? It's stagnant, right? That's the stag part. What's the flation part? Inflation, right? Costs were going up. And so we talked about this yesterday, peasants were not happy because they were starving, right? The cost of food, the cost of everything was going up, and they couldn't feed themselves, but the economy wasn't growing either, right? And even the royalty at that time, King Louis the 16th, they were actually broke. They had to go to the National Assembly and ask for money because of their lavish lifestyle and everything, they were broke, right? So the king was broke and people were starving. The queen is saying, well, let them. Okay, so this is what happened. And so, you know, I won't go through this in detail, but this is sort of a timeline of what happened in the French Revolution, right? This Edict of Versailles, it was really sort of catering to special interest groups at that time. And then they had the riots in Grenoble. And then in 1789, that's when the French Revolution officially started. You know, they created National Assembly, there were food riots, they stormed the Bastille to get weapons and also, you know, so on. You know, and then in 1791, they arrested the royal family. There were food riots in 1792, and then they started to create all these different groups, right? They had this group called the Jacobins, and they went out and massacred a whole bunch of people who were against them, right? I mean, we talk about cancel culture today. Cancel culture during French Revolution meant something completely different, right? They really canceled you. You know, and then in 1793, Louis the 16th was executed, and then there was this new committee called the Committee of Public Safety, but I don't think anybody felt any safer because of the Committee of Public Safety, because what they did was they went around and executed people. So that was their idea of public safety, right? And then there was the group called the Jacobins were then executed by the Committee of Safety, which, again, it's crazy. And then a new group came along, and they were called the Directory, and the Directory appointed Napoleon, Napoleon Bonaparte, as general of the French army, and but then Napoleon didn't like the Directory, and he was planning a coup d'etat against the Directory. And eventually, in 1799, Napoleon takes power over the Directory and takes power over the country. And that's sort of how the French Revolution ended. But you can see that it took a decade, right, for this uprising and all the changes to happen before it finally ended up in this change in power. And you can see sort of the similar kinds of things happening today where there's, you know, I mean, we don't have food riots today, but we certainly have a lot of protests, right? Well, we do have food riots if you go to places like Sri Lanka or Bangladesh. They are actually having food riots. But, you know, we're having protests in Europe and different places. You know, the farmers, we talked about them. But there's a lot of problems. There's a lot of pressure right now. And as we think about where we are today, you know, we talked about this, we started back in the late, 2018, 2019, we had a trade war going, right, with China because of their unfair trade practices. And then we had these supply chain disruptions. And then what happened then? Well, then we had the COVID-19 lockdowns.
central banks come in, they print $14 trillion to fix the problem, which really just made the problem worse. And then, we had all kinds of social unrest, right? You remember, the protest marches, Black Lives Matter, and all those kinds of things that were happening. And then we had the economic reopening because of the vaccine. And so, it's this wild roller coaster ride that we've been on, right? And because of that, we've had this tremendous amount of inflation starting. So I'm not going to go into all the details. And of course, the Ukraine crisis is happening. And so last night we looked at this prophecy in Revelation talking about out of control inflation, right? We see that that's starting to happen today. Now, but this is Sabbath school, right? So we want to do a little bit of a Bible study. So I give you that as a little bit of a background, and we're going to study, and I hope you brought your Bibles, so we're going to study Revelation 17. So if you have your Bibles, let's go to Revelation 17. Right? And I'm sorry that this is pretty hard to read, maybe, but... So when we look at prophecy, we have to understand that they come in layers, right? So last night we said, the basic timeline for prophecy that we understand is Daniel 2, right? The image of Daniel 2. Head of gold, chest of silver, bronze, so on, right? Everybody knows Daniel 2. And all the other prophecies sort of layer on top of that. It adds more detail to that timeline, right? But it doesn't really change that timeline. And we need to maintain that same timeline as we look at different prophecies. And that's very important for us to make sure that we're staying true to those timelines, okay? So all the different prophecies I've listed here just sort of adds to the details of that time, of that Daniel 2 timeline. As we get to the bottom, right, we see about the fall of Babylon, and that's shown in Revelation 17 and 18. Revelation 17, how many of you studied Revelation 17 before? Right? Is it an easy chapter? No, it's not. And even our scholars, we have different viewpoints about Revelation 17 and what it means. And it's a very difficult chapter to understand. But let's go to it, and if you haven't read it recently, you'll understand why Revelation 17 is such a difficult chapter, right? So let's read here. Okay, so the backdrop is that John is in a vision, and this angel comes, and he's showing him this vision. The angel carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness where I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names. I'm reading from verse 3. The woman was dressed in purple, and scarlet was glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls, right? So he's describing Babylon the Great, mystery, the mother of prostitutes and abominations of the earth. Okay, so then when we go to the next, let's go to Revelation 17, verse 7, right? It says here, I'm reading from NIV. Then the angel said to me, "Why are you astonished? I'll explain to you the mystery of the woman and the beast that she rides, which has 7 heads and 10 horns," right? So she's this beast that has 7 heads and 10 horns. Now that's a familiar imagery, but the words are somewhat confusing, right? It said, "The beast which you saw with 7 heads and 10 horns," oops, it's not staying up here. Okay. Right? "The beast you saw was and is not and will send out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition, the beast that was and is not and yet is." Is that clear? No. It's like, I'm going, what? Was, is not, and then is, and then, okay. So it's very confusing, right? It's very, very confusing. So we're going to break this down so we can understand exactly what the angel was trying to explain to John. All right. So as I said before, the timelines of Revelation and the book of Daniel are all in sync, right? They all work together. and to provide more detail. And as we look at, Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 8 and 9, Daniel 11, Revelation 6, 8, 9, Revelation 13, and Revelation 13, they all follow the same timeline, right? And it's important for us to understand that. So when we get to Revelation 17, now I know some scholars sort of change and say, well, this is means something else. But I think we should stick to the same time frame, right? Same timeline, because the Bible has very meticulously followed this timeline across. And so I believe that we're still using the same timeline in Revelation 17 as we have been through the rest of the Bible. Does that make sense? Right? Okay, so, and then we go to, towards the end, let's find out who are the players, who are the participants in this prophecy, okay? So we saw that there was this woman riding the scarlet beast, right? Babylon the Great. She was already identified. But who are some of these other characters in this prophecy? All right, so it says, in verse 12, it says, the 10 horns which you saw, if you go to verse 12, the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have not received kingdom as yet. So who we got? We have 10 kings, right? We have 10 kings. And then if we go to verse 16 there, it says, the beast and the 10 horns you saw will hate the whore, or hate the harlot, and make her desolate, right? So now we've got the 10 horns, now we have the beast, right? It says the beast, and they will hate the harlot and make her desolate. Okay? For God has put it in their hearts to fulfill his promise to be of one mind, to give their kingdom to the beast, right? So the beast and the 10 kings are different, right? The beast is not the 10 kings, the 10 kings are not the beast. And the harlot is not the 10 kings, nor is it the beast, right? They're different characters. Is that right? Is that clear? Okay, so those are the 10 characters. Those are the main characters in this. Right, so we need to better understand sort of how these interact now. Okay, so then let's go back and go back to verse. Let's see here, verse 9. Okay, verse 9. So it says, "For this calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. They are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, other is yet to come." Right? So 5 kingdoms have fallen, 1 is, and 1 is yet to come. So the angel is looking at a specific kingdom, right? Specific point in time, specific kingdom. So he says 5 are fallen. Which 5? Well, we know that there are 5 that have already fallen, right? Which is Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, and then what the 5th one would be what? The papacy, right? Because we saw the 1260-day prophecy ended when? We saw it in French Revolution, right, when the Pope was arrested. So 5 have fallen. That would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then it says 1 is. Well, who followed, what kingdom, if you will, followed after the fall of the papacy? And that's the big question, right? And that's where I think some folks get confused. So, and it says that they will ascend out of the bottomless pit, right? That's what in verse, the prophecy says. It says, the beast which you saw was not, and yet will come out of the abyss, or out of the bottomless pit. Well, where else have we seen this bottomless pit before? Right? Well, if we go to Revelation 11, we see this same creature coming out, right? It says in Revelation 11:3, if you want to turn there, I will give my power to the 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. And when they finish their testimony, the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit will make war against them and overcome them and kill them, right? So are we talking something about something that we've just been talking about, with 1260-day prophecy, right? What is this talking about? The French Revolution, right? So it's at the end of the 1260-day prophecy, my two witnesses, that was the New and the Old Testament, will prophesy, right? But then the beast that comes out of the bottomless pit will make war against them and overcome them and kill them, right? What was he talking about? Well, he was talking about all of the ideas that came during the French Revolution, right? You know, secular humanism, atheism, communism, evolutionism, all of that stuff came out during the time of the French Revolution, right? Why did that happen? Because people were tired of the church, right? Of the papacy just oppressing them all the time. And they were revolting, and so they were revolting against the king because they were hungry and they didn't have food, but they were also revolting against the church because they were tired of being oppressed by the church, right? And so they came up with all these other ideas that said, well, we don't need God, and we could be, you know, we could be better humans on our own without the need for God, right? And that's why the Bible warns us about the 1260 days 7 times in the Bible. 7 times it talks about the 1260-day prophecy, right? Because it was such a game changer. And is that impacting our world today? Are those ideas impacting the world today? Absolutely, right? Those are things that we are still fighting against today. Now, you know, we sometimes think that, well, you know, this is just an Adventist idea, right? But President James Madison, right? He wrote a lot about, he helped write a lot of the Constitution, right? This is what he said. He said, experience witnesses that ecclesiastical establishments, what is he talking about? Ecclesiastical establishment, what is that? The church, right? He says, instead of maintaining the purity and the efficacy of religion, have had a contrary operation. During almost 15 centuries has the legal establishment of Christianity been on trial. What has been its fruits, more or less, in all places, pride, indolence in the clergy, ignorance and servility in the laity, in both superstition, bigotry, and persecution. Right? Those are strong words. But notice, he says 15 centuries. Right? What is he talking about? Well, he's president around what? I can't remember exactly. 1826 or something? Early 1800s, right? So if he goes back 15th century, where does that take you back to? It takes you back to about the 4th century AD, right? Just when the church began to take power, right? It was when, remember Constantine? We talked about Constantine yesterday. Constantine comes in, he legalizes Christianity, right? And the church begins to take power. That's what he's talking about, right? From the 4th century AD, from the time when Constantine took power and the church began to grow stronger and stronger and stronger, and then, you know, over the 1260 years, since 538 AD, during that time, you know, was the church promoting pure religion? No, it was corrupt to its core, right? And it was using its power to oppress people. And so that's why people in the French Revolution revolted, right? And so in the Constitution, there's a strong separation of church and state, right? And this is the backdrop of why he saw that. He could see in history, you know, through the whole 15 centuries, he could see what it did, what happened to society, what happened to countries, what happened to governments when the church assumes power, right? And that's why there's a strong delineation between church and state, and that's so important in our Constitution, right? Let's go back to here. But Ellen White explained this very well in Great Controversy, right? She said, it was the popery that begun the work, which, oh, I'm sorry, that tree, the tree's sort of in the way. Well, that word is atheism, right? It was popery that begun the work, which atheism was completing. The policy of Rome had wrought out these conditions, social, political, and religious, that were hurrying France to ruin, right? So because of the oppression by the papacy, people revolted and rejected God. But that's a bad thing too, rejecting, Christian principles and morals, right? Our morality is founded on Judeo-Christian principles, right? And if you reject that, you throw that out, then you get the chaos that happened during the French Revolution. So the sixth head, what is it? Atheism, right? So if we said 5 are fallen, right? Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, papacy. And what does Ellen White say? She says it's atheism that was finishing off the work that the papacy had started. That sort of makes sense? So it's not a kingdom per se like Rome or whatever, but the papacy wasn't a specific country either, right? It was a religious power that sort of had sway over all of Europe. So atheism, this idea, these atheistic ideas that came out during the French Revolution, they're in control now, aren't they? Right? Right? If you don't agree with them, you get canceled today, right? If you have a different idea, if you say, heaven forbid, if you say that, a marriage should be between a man and a woman, man, you get, you put that on social media, you get all kinds of hate mail, right? Right? There's things you can't say anymore today in the kingdom that we live under that in times past we would have thought was pretty basic stuff, right? But that's where we're living in right now. Okay. So then when the angel said, well, 5 has fallen, 1 is, so she was looking at this time of the French Revolution, just after the French Revolution and where we are today. That's what the angel was looking at, right? But he said, 1 is yet to come, right? And of course, this is a tough one for us who live in the United States because we understand that to be Protestant America, right? We believe that, well, I'll read it from Ellen White, Great Controversy. Political corruption is destroying our love for justice and regard for the truth. And even in free America, rulers and legislators, in order to secure public favor, will yield to the demand for a law enforcing Sunday observation, right? Now, I know for us as Adventists who understand the Sabbath and so on, it makes sense. But there's a lot of folks, I have some good friends who are neighbors who are evangelicals, and they don't get it, right? Because they don't understand the Sabbath. But when I explain to them, I say, it's about the separation of church and state. Then it starts to make more sense to them, right? It says, okay, I know you don't understand why we like Sabbath, why we think Sabbath is important, but do you agree with the separation of church and state? Of course, well, many of us do. Anyway, some don't, but they can agree to that, right? And that's common ground that we can find with our friends who are Christians of other denominations, and say, we believe we're coming to this place where there's going to be a battle between conscience, right? Between what is right and what is wrong, and people are going to try and bring together the power of the church and state to oppress. That's what we believe. And I think many people can understand that. We can even see that happening today, right? And I know, I told you yesterday, I'm Canadian. I'm not Republican, Democrat, or anything. I'm just an observer. But I can see that, when you think about Democrats and Republicans, the Democrats are way on the left, and generally speaking, we don't think them as religious, and Republicans tend to be much more, conservative Christian religion, right? And so the swing and the power, over the last, I'd say, several decades anyways, have been continually pushing to the left, right? The left agenda has been continuing to be pushed. But perhaps that's going to swing and that's going to change. And as we go into kind of an economic tailspin, as things get worse, you know, people are more likely to do what? Go more liberal or become more conservative, right? And that's what we think. So, you know, 5 are fallen. One is we're living under this regime of atheism and these humanistic ideas. One is yet to come, which is this more conservative Christian viewpoint. But the problem there is not that we don't believe in the Christian viewpoint, is that when you combine church and state, bad things happen. Okay? And then it says, and then there's a, you know, really confusing thing. It says the 7-headed beast, right? I will tell you the mystery of the woman with the beast that carries her, which has 7 heads and 10 horns. Oh, by the way, the beast that was and is not, he's the 8th and is of the 7th and goes into perdition. Well, this is a 7-headed beast who has eight heads, right? It's a little confusing, but you'll see what maybe, you know, you'll see what I mean by this, or what the angel means by this. But clearly she's saying it's a 7-headed beast, but there's an 8th head, right? So 5 are fallen, one is yet to come, and then there's this 8th head. Okay, the revival of the papacy. Now let's think about it this way. I try to explain this in sort of an illustration here. Let's think about a pendulum swinging back and forth, right? Pendulum goes back and forth. All right, and let's think about God's people over the centuries and how they were influenced by governments that were around them, right? And so, you know, Israel, they were following God, but then they backslid, and then they were captured by Babylon, right? So they were taken to Babylon, and so the pendulum swings. And what kind of country was Babylon? It was this pagan country, right? They didn't believe, when I say godless, they're not fearing Jehovah, right? They had lots of other gods, but not the true God. So they're a godless society. So Israel gets plunged into this pagan society, right? Okay, so then 70 years passes, and what happens? Babylon gets taken over by Medo-Persia, right? So Medo-Persia, what happened during Medo-Persia? So pendulum swings over here. Medo-Persia did what? They allowed the Israelites to go back to rebuild the temple, right? And restart their, you know, temple services and so on. And so went back to this more God-fearing religious side. But did they stop there? No. So what happened in Israel was during that time, right, we had the growth of different sects like the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Zealots, all of these very super conservative groups, and they came in and, you know, they made so many more laws and you know, forced people to observe them because they thought that by observing all these laws, they could appease God so that they wouldn't get sent into captivity again, right? So the pendulum swings hard to this super conservative, ultra conservative side, right? Right, then what happened? Who comes next? Greece, right? Greece comes in, and Greece has many gods, you know, right? Zeus, Apollo, Aphrodite, all those guys. And then Rome, too. Rome and Greece basically had the same gods, right? They just called them different things, right? So if you had, you know, Zeus was Jupiter, right? Ares was Mars, Aphrodite was Venus, and so on. So, but it's basically the same religion. And so Israel gets thrown again into this pagan society, and they sort of become much more liberal, or at least their surroundings are much more liberal. What happens next? Papacy. And what kind of, right? Ultra-conservative religious But of course, they're corrupt to the core. But on the surface, there's this very pious religious organization, right? Okay, so now where do we go next? Well, that is the Dark Ages, right? So we come out of the Dark Ages, and what did we just see? Atheism, right? So atheism naturally means godless, right? So we swing way over here, right? This is making sense, right? And it just keeps swinging us back and forth. And every time we swing, we're really losing our identity. We're losing touch with who God is, right? And so we're in this atheistic, humanistic society today where, we have gender fluidity, we have, I don't want to go all the way through, right? Where do we go next? Where does the pendulum swing next? The other way, right? The pendulum swings this way, and we come into this ultra-conservative, and nothing wrong with being conservative, don't get me wrong, right? But it's what? It's when we lose the dividing line between church and state, when the state supports the church or the church supports the state and tries to control people through that, that's when we run into trouble. And that's why James Madison's looking at this and going, yep, church and state, not a good thing, right? And in fact, the Bible, the only being that has the authority of government and of ecclesiastical power, who's that? God, right? Only God has authority over church and state, right? So anybody who's trying to take over church and state is trying to usurp the power of God. And that's exactly what Satan did, right? Satan wanted glory for himself. He wanted to control, he wanted to rule the heavens, but he also wanted the beings to worship him, right? He wanted the power of God. And that's what this is talking about here, right? So, and again, for me, I think this is an easier way to talk to my evangelical friends about what we think is going to happen, right? And again, it's not that I don't believe that there's not a Sunday law and all that I think that's going to happen. But when I'm talking to my neighbor Jim across the street, who is very much an evangelical, I'm not saying to him, look out for the Sunday law, because it's coming. But when I talk about separation of church and state and what's happening in the country and the changes that are happening, we have a much better conversation about these things, right? And how does it happen? Well, we know that Revelation 13 says what? It performed great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to cause to the earth in full view of the people. Because of the signs it was given, the power to perform on behalf of the first beast, it deceived the inhabitants of the world, right? So this power, this false miracles and things help convince the world that they should follow this new power, all right? But something goes wrong, right? Even though this new, we have, let's go back to here. We have all these signs and miracles and wonders happening. Something happens because that power does not maintain, right? And it says that there's one more power that comes into play, this eighth head, the seven-headed beast with the eighth head. But why is it the eighth head? Because the eighth head is actually the same as the fifth one, right? It's part of, it said it's part of the seven. It's the eighth manifestation, but it was really already there because it was already part of that seven-headed beast, right? So does that sort of make sense, right? And so this is what Revelation 17, I think, is trying to tell us, the events of the things that are going to happen next. And I think it's important for us because we need to be able to have that conversation with our neighbors and our friends and explain to them, like, we believe in the Constitution. I'm a Canadian. I still think that the American Constitution is the best governing document ever written, right? But as soon as you sort of stray away from that, we can run into trouble. And I can have a conversation with my friends who are evangelicals or Muslims or whatever, right? Because even Muslims can see that, right? When the government controls religion and the state, right? They can do some terrible things. And so, I think this is sort of the understanding that we want to try and give our friends, that when we think about religion and end times and so on, I firmly believe that there will be a lot of Americans, Canadians, people of conscience who will watch this and go, the merging of church and state, and oppression of people, persecution of people who don't believe in that, and they're going to go, I can't buy that. I can't go along with that. There has to be a different way, right? And that people of conscience will stand up and they'll be open to the truth that we have for them. I'm going to just leave, and we're going to close the Sabbath School now. I'm just going to leave you with another quote from James Madison. He says, "What influence, in fact, have ecclesiastical establishment had on society? In some instances, they have been seen to erect a spiritual tyranny on the ruins of civil authority. In many instances, they have been seen upholding the thrones of political tyranny. In no instances have they been the guardians of liberties of the people. Rulers who wish to subvert the public liberty must have found an established clergy convenient auxiliaries. Just government, instituted, secure, and perpetuated, it meaning liberty, needs them not." And so clearly James Madison was thinking, church and state, we can never have them put together, because if the government tries to control the conscience of people, it always ends up bad. Right? And I believe that's the case, but unfortunately, as things get worse in the economy, as things get worse politically, and we're like, there are bad things happening, right? There's a river in Germany called the Rhine. It's a main transport line that goes through Europe, right? It's almost dried up to the point that they can no longer do any shipping through that, right? There's parts of Europe that are just really right now under severe drought conditions. Some of our own country, Midwest and on, seeing droughts. We're seeing this lack of food and rioting in different parts of the world because of high costs of food, right? All of this stuff is happening now, and we can see that, and people are going to react and say, government, they're going to turn to the government and say, help us, right? And of course they should, but when we get to the point where the government and the church are trying to get together to establish the rules, that's when we're going to have problems. And that is going to be the downfall of Babylon, right? That's what the Bible is trying to explain to us. So I hope this helps sort of understand what I think is Revelation 17 and what it's trying to tell us and the warnings it's trying to give. And if we better understand this, then I think we're able to speak to our neighbors and our friends about this in a way that they can appreciate and consider, and not just dismiss, oh, there's those Adventists that they don't know what they're talking about. But I think we can enter these conversations with people and have a commonality that I think people will share, and be able to have a good conversation about it. And they may not agree with you at the moment, but as they see time pass and see the things transpire, maybe that'll spark a memory of them and say, hey, I remember when we had that conversation, right, about church and state and so on. Let's talk again, Anyways, I hope this has been helpful. Again, I'm around, and if you have any questions or if you have any, if you think I'm wrong, I'm always open to the fact that I could be wrong, right? Yes, ma'am.